Welcome back to the Favored File. A Chinese Christian came to a missionary one time and said, I have memorized the entire Sermon on the Mount and I can quote it before you. And he stood before the missionary and perfectly quoted the sermon word by word. The missionary was so impressed and he asked him, This is just so wonderful. How did you do it? Was it an easy process? The Chinese Christian said, No, sir, it was not an easy process. I spent the last 2 years trying to leave it. That is how I learned it by heart. A renowned British preacher once said that the greatest threat to the Christianity is not atheism or any other religion. The greatest threat to Christianity is Christians trying to sneak into heaven without ever sharing their faith, without ever living Christian life, without ever becoming involved in any of the significant work that God is doing on the planet Earth. This was the exact problem Jesus was trying to solve through the Sermon on the Mount. Just think about the crowd that Jesus was speaking to. It was not an educated lot or a United Nations council meeting, or it was not the Congress or the parliamentary assembly that was there. It was a crowd on the hillside. It was a group of common people living common ordinary lives. They are under some occupation. They are not lawmakers. They are not great planners of their future. They do not have a goal in their life. Yet, Jesus is saying to them, You are the salt of the earth. We may think we are insignificant, but what I tell you is, if you have Christ within you, you are made to make an incredible difference in this world. I recently read another story in which a man was walking through the country fair that happens, and he met a tiny little girl, and she was carrying a gigantic cotton candy, which was almost as big as her. And he said to her, How can you eat this whole candy? Because that is bigger than you. And she looked up at him and said, Well, I am really much bigger inside than I am outside. This is actually true for all of us. We are the salt of the earth. Why does Jesus refer to us as salt? Salt is a miracle. As you know, it is the chemically composed of sodium and chloride. Now pour a little chloric acid on your hand. It will burn our hand within less than a minute. Try drinking chloric acid and you will die with such pain very quickly. But when you add sodium to chloride, you have salt, which is the most useful substance on the earth. You need to understand how valuable salt was in the days of Jesus. What we take granted today was like gold for them. You see, salt is a preservative, and 2000 years ago, people did not have a fridge. Salt was so valuable in the Bible days that it was often traded for gold. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. In fact, the word salary is derived from the word salt. If Roman soldiers didn't do his job, he wouldn't get his salt. That is where actually the phrase itself comes, that he is not worth his salt. And even in Indian language they say namak haram. It means that person is not faithful to the salt that he had. Our world is decaying. Our job as salt is to preserve the holiness of God and the goodness of Jesus as much as we can. But as bad as things are, can we imagine how bad things would be if there were no churches also? How bad things would be if there were no Christians? How bad would things be if there were no Bibles? How bad things would be if there was no preachers of the gospel? Yes, we need to be the salt, but there is a danger. Jesus says that if the salt loses its flavor, how can it be used for seasoning? Now, any chemistry teacher will tell us that it is impossible in any way that salt becomes saltless or unsalty. Sodium chloride is one of the most stable compound in this universe. It doesn't change and it never loses character. But there is truth to what Jesus is saying. You see, much of the salt that was used in the Israel times came from the Dead Sea, which is far below the sea level. The waters of the Sea of Galilee flow into Jordan River and from the Dead Sea to the bottom of the earth. Once the water gets there, there's no place to go. The hot sun evaporates the water and leaves behind a chunky white powder made up of a combination of salt and minerals. That powder contains enough salt to season the meat, to flavor up the soup. That is why people used to get their salt from the Dead Sea. But it is also mixed with minerals and it's not pure salt. It is possible with little wetness in the air for that salt to be dissolved and become a waste. When that happens, the salt loses its seasoning. So, what does that have to do with us, with you and me? Well, the worst thing that a Christian could lose is not his wealth or his job or his health or his family or not even his life. The worst thing a Christian can lose in his life is his testimony. Because when you lose your testimony, your salt loses its seasoning, it loses its flavor. When that happens, Jesus is going to say, it is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Means it is literally good for nothing. The one thing that contaminates the salt in our life is the dirt of the worldliness. It is once a person said that I looked for the church and I found it in the world. And when I looked for the world, I found it in the church. We lose our seasoning when we conform to the culture around us. Instead of transforming that culture, we conform to that culture. What does that mean? Whenever salt was brought from the Dead Sea, when it was contaminated with other minerals, then it would make a very bad taste and the salt becomes useless. So they would not throw it in the garden or in the field because that will spoil the plantation. So instead of that, they would throw it on the roads where it will mix with the dirt, and when people walk over it, it just disappears. I heard about a man that walked into a grocery store and said, "Do you sell salt?" The grocery man said, "Do we sell salt? Just look around." And the grocery man showed the customer an entire wall of shells that was stocked with only salt. Means the iodized salt, sea salt, rock salt, garlic salt, Epsom salt, and every kind of salt that was imaginable. The customer was amazed. And the grocery man said, "You think that is something? Come over here." And he led the customer to the back room that was filled with shells and cartons and barrels of salt. And the customer was surprised and he said, "This is not anything much." And he took them to the basement that was 5 times larger than the previous room. And that also was filled with shelves wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with every form of salt that was imaginable. The customer finally looked at that grocery man and said, "Do you really sell salt?" And the grocery man said, "No, we don't. That is the problem. We never sell salt." But that salt salesman, he comes every week and he sells salt. Here is the point: salt that stays on the shelf does not do anyone any good. It must get out and it must be different. Let us be the salt that comes out of the salt shaker and the ones that seasons the people's lives that are around us. Thank you. See you soon. God bless.